So the way that we decide if whether an interval or a chord is major or minor, augmented or diminished, is by the distance between those two notes or more notes. So in the major key, we'll say that the way that we tune our keyboards and our musical instruments, if you start on a C and end on a C, we'll have what's called a major scale. A scale is a series of notes played in order. So this is the way we tune all of our musical instruments, and if we start on C and play a scale up and down to C, we'll have what's called a major scale. We also call that do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And likewise, we can play it down. Now, within the scale, the relationships of all the notes within the scale in a major key, if you don't go outside of the key, we have 7 basic intervals. When we count the distance between two notes, we always count the first note as 1. I know that gets a little confusing, but you'll catch on in a bit. So the interval between the first and second note of any major scale, the distance apart between those two, is what we call a whole step or a major second. So if we count the first note, 1, 2, we call that an interval of a second because they're 2 notes apart. Remember, always count the first note. We're going to look at why we call it a major second in a few minutes, but suffice it to say that between the first note and the second note of a major scale, the distance apart between those two is a major second, or we call that also a whole step. Now, the distance between the root, the main note in a scale, in a major scale, we call it the tonic, the home, or the 1. So in the key of C, the C note will be the home. And the home is really the only finished sounding note. It's at the end of most songs end on the 1 or the tonic. So if you're in the key of C, most songs will actually end on a C. And we call that C home or finish. Now the distance between the first and third note of a scale, of a major scale, are what we call a major third. You count the first note, 1, 2, 3. So the distance between the first and third note of any major scale are what we call a major third. We'll learn about major and minor thirds in a later class. Now the distance between the first and fourth note of the major scale is a fourth. 1, 2, 3, 4. We call that a perfect fourth. We call it a perfect fourth because it's neither major nor minor, and it doesn't really change the tonality of a chord. It doesn't make a chord major or minor, and it's kind of a plain sounding interval. We call that a perfect fourth. One of the things about a perfect interval is if we invert them, if we take this C and play a higher C, it's still a perfect interval. It's a different interval, but it's still perfect. So when you invert a perfect interval, it remains perfect. So the fourth note of the scale in relation to the home is a perfect fourth. And the distance between the root and fifth of a major scale, we call it a perfect fifth. Likewise, if you raise the C up an octave, you're going to still have a perfect interval. So when you invert a perfect interval, when you take the low note and make it the higher note, a perfect interval remains a perfect interval. The next interval is the sixth, the distance between the root and the sixth of a major scale, and it's called a major six. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We call that a major six, so in every major scale, the distance between the root and the sixth note of the scale is a major six. Interestingly enough, we'll talk about minor later. That would be a minor six, an interval of a minor six. And this is the interval of a major six. So in a major scale, the distance between the root and the sixth note of the scale is a major six. Then the seventh note of the scale, the distance between the root and the seventh, we call it a major seventh. Remember, you count the first note, that's 7 notes. We call it a major seventh. In all major scales, the distance between the root and the seventh note of the scale is a major seventh. And then we're back to the octave, which is a perfect interval.